This might be a long video, this might be a short video, who knows at this point. Guys, welcome back to my channel. It is a very sunny day here in England, so the blinds are down quite a bit because whenever I lift the blinds I just get sun in my eyes, sun all over my Spirit jersey. You wouldn't be able to see me. So today is a very different video. Last week, I believe it would have been May the 1st, but I was doing a collaboration video that day, so if you missed that I will leave a card. It would have been 5 years since I handed in my university dissertation, and my mum recently found it out, and a lot of you have said for a while that you were interested in my dissertation topic, so I thought I would do a little video about it. So this is actually my dissertation. The title of it was Analysing Death, Dying and Bereavement in Disney Pixar's Up, and it was submitted to the University of Worcester for my joint honours English and Media and Cultural Studies degree. So I handed this in May 2015. I must have been working on this for at least a year, but I'm going to talk you through the process, how I went from idea to reality, and I'm also going to read some of it for you guys. So I knew from the get-go, I knew that my final year dissertation could be either an English dissertation or a media dissertation. So I decided right then and there that I wanted to do something Disney. Obviously I haven't, I chose Pixar, but I'll get on to what changed my mind in a minute. So obviously when you're in the first year, you don't really have to think about your dissertation, but I was, because I was really excited about being able to do something Disney, or in this case Pixar. I had a few ideas, but I knew that my auntie had done her dissertation on women in Disney, so I sort of strayed away from Disney because I didn't want it to look like I was just copying a member of my family or trying to make this easier on me. I actually wanted it to be completely my own. I didn't want anybody's help, so I decided that I would choose Pixar. So all through my 3 years at university, my personal tutor was amazing. She always wanted to listen to my ideas for my dissertation, and by midway through year 2 we had to do a pitch for our dissertation, and at the time I was just doing very broadly death in Pixar. So I had this slideshow which I can't find now unfortunately, and Up was obviously in there. So there was Ellie's death and Charles Muntz's death, and then I had Finding Nemo for Coral's death, and then I had Bug's Life for Hopper's death. So this slideshow plays and someone says in the feedback portion of the presentation, like, what do these three have in common? And I stood there and I thought about it, and I thought, no, they actually have nothing in common, do they? So I decided then and there that I would just do Up. There were 2 actual deaths in Up and then 1 hinted at death. We all know it was a death, but they never mentioned it in the film. It was just a passing scene that if you blinked you missed it, although I don't think anybody missed it, as everybody talks about how upsetting the first 10 minutes of Up are. So I needed to make this into a cohesive topic. So I decided that it would not only be about death, but it would be about how dying is shown due to that montage, and how bereavement is handled and represented due to how Carl reacts after Ellie has passed. Obviously if I was doing it today, there's now Coco, which is absolutely incredible. I would have loved to have written my dissertation on that, and then most recently there's Onward, where they do actually say quite a few times, your father died, your father passed, things like that. The language in Onward would have been great to write a dissertation topic on, but I had to go with visuals. If you didn't see my review on Onward, by the way, I will leave a card because I really enjoyed Onward, and I can't wait to see it again when it releases on DVD in the UK. So end of second year, going into third year, I was supposed to start my dissertation. Everybody thought I had already started it, but in the summer break of my second year going into my third year, I lost my nan very, very unexpectedly. She did have an illness, but she wasn't near the end of her life, so her death was very sudden. And as you can imagine, I really didn't want to write a dissertation on death when I was grieving myself, although once I did start to write it, it did really help. But what I struggled with was to watch Ellie die when Ellie was an old lady and I'd just lost my nan, so it felt too real to me at that time. My personal tutor was really understanding, but I do think that I cost myself the grade I wanted for this. I missed about 3 or 4 months working on it, so that is all completely on me, and that's something I've got to live with. I just didn't handle my grief very well, and I couldn't do anything on my dissertation. But the reason I chose something that was a completely new topic was because I really wanted to try this for myself, like try and make my own theory. I remember at university I used to get asked a lot about what I thought about the Pixar theory, and I do really sign up to the Pixar theory. I think it's amazing that they think that all of the films are linked, but when I was trying to do a dissertation, they don't actually link together in a way that is recognised by everybody. So I couldn't say that Up was similar to Finding Nemo, because it really wasn't. The Pixar theory makes them link in an alternate universe, and you really have to be a Pixar fan to sign up to the Pixar theory. So I'm going to read some bits of my dissertation now. In the beginning there is a thank you to my personal tutor Barbara Mitra. She was an absolutely incredible lecturer, and she was such a big help with this dissertation. She was always reading things over for me and checking that something made sense. So normally if you do a dissertation you can just get a load of books out of the library. However, there wasn't anything written on Pixar, so I basically just chose books on death, dying and bereavement and applied them to Pixar, which did make it more difficult, but I was analysing representation, and unless it's been done before, this is the way you have to do it. So, the introduction. Death comes to all living things. It is the final stage in the life cycle, is inevitable and irreversible, and is caused by a breakdown in the functioning of the body. Death is common within the media, especially in the news. Media coverage of tragedies suggests that our culture of mourning is defined by the public finding an appropriate outlet for their grief. The commodification of death sites and burial sites has emerged through Hollywood death tours, offering fans the chance to visit where their favourite celebrities die. It's funny that I wrote this, because in 2018 I actually saw the hospital that Walt Disney passed away in. We were taken to Walt Disney Studios, and a lot of people know that he died in the hospital that was across the street from the studios. So while not intentionally visiting where he died, I've visited where he died. So that's really strange that I wrote that. Death in film raises issues of provoking thoughts of death in the viewer as they compare themselves to the protagonist. Popular culture offers a platform for teaching children about death. As a child, the death of a family member can be confusing, and trying to make sense of what has happened is a difficult challenge for children, and the grief can affect their mental health and development later in life. I decided that I would focus on the theme of death, dying and bereavement in Up as the Oscar winner for Best Animated Feature Film of the Year in 2010, as it contained 2 deaths of main characters and 1 debatable death. For a children's film to show humans dying is a step away from Disney and Pixar films of the past, such as Bambi, The Lion King and Finding Nemo. By exploring the representation of death in Up, I will be able to analyse how accurately death is portrayed in children's films. By analysing how Carl and Ellie's experiences compare to real-life case studies and theories, I will be able to determine whether death is represented as truthfully as real-life accounts. And then in a dissertation you have to do like loads of pages of, it's called methodology, and it's basically where you talk about the research. So I had to do a lot of textual analysis and narrative analysis as well, and then there's a whole section on the theories of death and dying as well. So the first one I wanted to talk about in relation to Ellie was Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of dying. Obviously it's different for every individual, but this has been summed up as a standard theory for how dying comes about. Kubler-Ross offers the 5 stages of dying, where the first stage is denial. So even though everyone's experiences are different, this theorist offered 5 stages that most people fall into. So the first stage is denial, which is a temporary defence when the patient is first given their diagnosis, which is usually followed by partial acceptance. The second stage is anger, where patients ask why me and get angry at God. The third stage is bargaining, whereby a patient asks to do one last activity that they couldn't do because of illness, and is essentially an attempt to postpone the inevitable. The fourth stage is depression, where the patient enters into preparatory grief, saying goodbye to loved ones and preparing to die. The fifth and final stage is acceptance, where the patient has mourned the impending loss of life and family and is prepared to die. However, it is known that not every patient will feel that way, not everybody will accept about it. Not every person will get angry about it. And then I used many more theories, but the other theory I like to focus on in this dissertation was Kavanagh's 7 stages of bereavement, which I used for Carl after Ellie has passed. So stage 1 is shock and denial, where the mourner must learn to accept the loss. Number 2 is disorganisation, which is common for the newly bereaved, where the mourner feels lost and confused. Number 3, volatile reactions, feeling angry and hurt at the loss. Number 4, guilt, feeling as though they could have done something differently. Number 5, loss and loneliness, missing the deceased, helped by forming new relationships. Number 6, relief, the sudden realisation that the deceased no longer feels pain. And number 7, re-establishment, fully experiencing the loss and managing to move on from the pain it has caused. So I think you can already see from me reading those out which ones apply to Carl and which ones I argued later on in my dissertation. And then I used Freud's concept of grief, which is a process that allows the bereaved to move on, basically. So task 1, you have to accept the reality of the loss. Task 2, you have to experience the pain of grief. Task 3, you have to adjust to an environment in which the deceased is missing, which I argued is something that Carl really did struggle with, because he didn't want his house to be demolished that he lived in with Ellie, and he kept it exactly the same as when she was alive. And finally, task 4, withdraw emotional energy and reinvest it in another relationship, which I'm pretty sure I argued was what Kevin was for. I think the only reason Kevin was in the plot was so that Carl had someone close to him again. And now on to my analysis of Up. It is important to remember that my interpretation of the film may be different from someone else's, and since this film is aimed at children, my interpretations may only be reached by parents watching with their children. So I started with death. The first death is open to interpretation. With no dialogue throughout the montage, the scene leaves its viewers to read it how they feel best. The upbeat music playing at the beginning of the montage when the viewer sees Carl and Ellie getting married and building a house quickly segues into a solemn version of the tune as the next scene takes place in a doctor's office. Carl is shown laying his hand on his wife Ellie's shoulder as her head is in her hands. Ellie appears to be crying and Carl also looks very sad, as does the doctor. This offers the interpretation that the doctor has given the couple bad news, which the viewer can interpret in 2 ways depending on how they read the signs. The first interpretation, and presumably the dominant reading, is that Ellie has lost her baby. Previous scenes showed her and Carl decorating the nursery, and on the wall Ellie has painted a stork holding a sack, a code which resembles the childhood myth of babies being delivered by the stork, as portrayed in the children's film Dumbo. The signified meaning of the mural is that painting a baby's room is seen as a common pre-arrival ritual, usually because expectant parents wait to know the gender and style the room accordingly. This sign and its relative meanings could leave the viewer to assume that Ellie has suffered a miscarriage. However, as the montage shows no other attempts to have a child, an alternative reading could be that Ellie and Carl are told that they are unable to have children. Whichever interpretation the viewer accepts, Ellie and Carl do not try to have children again. Another sign to consider would be that Ellie has no sign of a bump. This could support either interpretation, an early miscarriage or a longing to have a baby that was denied. The signifier to support the dominant reading could be that she was in the very early stages of pregnancy. So I've always believed that it meant that they had lost a baby, and I think a lot of people think that, but when you write dissertations you have to think of every single interpretation that there could possibly be, and there isn't a lot to say on that scene, but I know what I think it is, so I do consider it a death. But the next one I'm going to go on to is Ellie's death. Ellie's death is quite soon after the baby's in narrative time, and it is clear she has died when Carl sits in the same church where he married Ellie. This time he is sat alone at the altar steps. From the vantage point of the animators, they have represented Ellie's biological death. It is presumed this was her funeral from the flowers and balloons around Carl, and the altar is missing, presumably to make space for the coffin. The scene is dark, which helps to create a solemn mood. Here, Spellman's notion of a funeral being a sign of affection and eternal love is portrayed by Carl's reluctance to leave even after everyone else has gone and the coffin has been taken away. Her funeral can also be seen as helping Carl come to terms with her loss and celebrating Ellie's life. The final person to die is the villain, Charles F. Muntz. Before his death, there is actually an attempt by Charles to kill Carl with a sword, but Carl uses his cane to intercept the blow that would have hit him straight in the face. As a chase ensues, Carl runs through the floating house as Charles follows. Carl manages to jump to safety with his companions holding onto a rope, but Charles gets his ankle caught on the strings of the balloon and ends up falling to his death, with some balloons still attached to him in an anticlimactic end. I feel like I could have wrote more there. When Ellie is dying in the hospital, the viewer is not told what illness she is suffering from. However, viewers can use signs within the scene to create their own interpretation. After Ellie's miscarriage, the story speeds up to when Carl and Ellie are in their retirement years. What first alerts the viewer to her illness is when she collapses climbing up the hill to the park. She will take a few steps and then fall, and she does this a few times until Carl panics and hurries to her side. This inability to undergo simple everyday tasks reflects Kastenbaum's restricted activity and limited energy models, which both signify the end of Ellie's life as she knew it. She is then shown lying in a hospital bed, evoking meanings of dying in hospital rather than at home. Since there are no visible signs of an illness, it may be interpreted that Ellie was suffering from an internal illness, as she is reduced to a hospital bed in a private room. Her hospitalisation grants Carl an opportunity to make plans for after her death, whether or not he chose to do so. As for those 5 stages I mentioned earlier, there is no sign of Ellie undergoing the first 4 stages, but she accepts her fate when she hands the adventure book over to Carl in the hospital. This is Ellie's way of saying that she is unable to have any more adventures and wants Carl to continue her legacy, which he takes as motivation to travel to Paradise Falls. And then that's when I go on to Bereavement. I wish I'd have wrote more, and reading it back now, it would have been better if I'd wrote more, but the bereavement part was always my favourite part. If Ellie and Carl did lose a child, then her reaction is one of bereavement, but even infertility can be mourned. Ellie appears to be withdrawn and lost, perhaps feeling that society rejects her grief, perhaps viewing an unborn child as an object rather than a person. Carl's grief may have begun as soon as Ellie was hospitalised, through anticipatory grief and preparing for the loss of his wife. As the montage does not give a time frame, the viewer does not know how long Ellie was ill for, but her hospitalisation suggests a gap between her diagnosis and subsequent death. Nevertheless, Ellie's death would have come as a shock to Carl whether or not anticipatory grief had been experienced. As for post-death grief, it can be argued that Carl's grief develops over time. At the funeral, Carl sits alone near where her coffin would have been displayed. His behaviour mimics acute grief as he appears lost without Ellie and longs to have her back. This denial may come from Ellie's death intruding on their happy life together, but a child viewing this may believe that Ellie has simply abandoned Carl. Later on, Carl begins to express integrated grief as he can undertake his everyday routine whilst still mourning. As an older widower, Carl is more vulnerable than a younger person. Carl uses a stair lift to go downstairs, suggesting his health could be at risk from living alone. Carl is reluctant to leave the home he shared with Ellie, which is what drives the narrative. He holds on to Ellie by talking to her throughout the film as if she was still alive, but his loneliness suggests that he may not have embraced anticipatory grief. Alternatively, Carl might have tried active coping in the early months after Ellie's death. His grief is not explicit, signifying he may not be dealing with his emotions properly, and his reluctance to move into the retirement home may signify avoidance of carers and health specialists. This may be due to a lack of trust, as they let him down by not saving Ellie. When Carl assaults the construction worker, this displays Kavanagh's notion of a volatile reaction. Carl also shouts, "Get away from our mailbox," character dialogue indicating that Carl is still adjusting to life without Ellie. As Carl enters into complicated grief, this suggests that Ellie may have been dead for over 6 months. His desire to take the house to Paradise Falls signifies a need to be close to Ellie by fulfilling her lifelong dream. At one point he says, "We're on our way, Ellie," and kisses a photo of her, showing that he is doing this for her. Carl's use of stage dialogue signifies that he is still in denial that she is gone. But once Carl meets Russell, the boy who accompanies him on his journey, his grief slowly diminishes, even if at first he is reluctant to let someone new into his life. Here, Carl is characterised as a grumpy old man that doesn't want a child ruining his trip with Ellie. Russell is a key character in helping Carl go through Warden's tasks of grieving. Carl is reluctant to accept that Ellie is gone by holding on to their house, and some may argue that he never comes to terms with the loss. Though he does experience grief, it is debatable whether he ever adjusts to life without Ellie, as he keeps his house exactly as he left it. Russell helps Carl to reinvest his love for Ellie into another relationship and becomes a pseudo-father to Russell as he accompanies him to his Wilderness Explorer Awards ceremony. For the film to explore Carl's grieving process, Pixar followed the example set by The Lion King, in that the death of Ellie is not seen as a fleeting moment that goes unexplained, and in Carl's mourning, her death is recognised. Her death at the beginning sets up the narrative for the entire film. And then I talk about a bit of imagery about how the balloons keep coming back during the film, as it's like a running motif. But those were basically the main points I made about death, dying and bereavement. Reading it back and having all the experience I have now and all the Pixar knowledge I have now, especially from videos like Seamus Gorman's and the Super Carlin brothers, I feel like today I could write a completely new dissertation on the same topic that would get a better grade. But obviously I was like 21 back then and I was grieving myself, so obviously hindsight's 2020, isn't it? So that was my dissertation and little bits of it. I hope this wasn't too boring for you guys. A lot of people did say on Instagram that they really wanted me to talk about this topic. In fact, I did actually have 2 questions. Mermaid Handmade Treasures said she'd be really interested in knowing why I chose Up, and I basically went over this in the beginning. I really wanted to do something that hadn't been done before, which is why I went for Pixar instead of Disney, and I chose death because a lot of people do things like race and gender and things like that, and I wanted to do something that is shown in these Pixar films but are kids films, so I wanted to see how it's represented. I consider death to be an adult theme, so to be in a kids film I was really interested in, and Up is one of the best known for having death in the film basically. And then SP Farrell said, I'm most curious why you chose to focus on this film, which again I've gone into, but was it more the subject matter or the film itself that inspired your dissertation topic? So I had death first. Like I said, it was going to be death in Pixar films, which again would be easier today because there's also Coco and onward. So I had the topic first and then I narrowed it down to Up because it was best to focus on one film and just look at the 2 or 3 different deaths in that film. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, just drop it in the comments down below. Please give it a big thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and I will see you real soon for another video. Bye guys!